Richard Kane, the hard-nosed CEO of Apex Global Technologies, prided himself on knowing everything that happened within his company. He made it a point to take surprise walks through the office halls, especially after hours when most employees had gone home. It gave him an honest glimpse of the company culture. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear. As he turned the corner near the break room, a sharp conversation in Mandarin caught his ear. Intrigued, he paused. The voice was fluent, polished, and authoritative. He peeked through the glass, expecting to see one of his foreign liaison officers or perhaps someone from the international relations team. Instead, he saw Miguel. Miguel, the janitor. The man was leaning against the table, one hand holding a mop and the other gesturing midair as he spoke into his phone. The conversation was peppered with logistics jargon, and from what Richard could gather, it was a heated negotiation about freight delays and port clearances. When Miguel hung up, Richard stepped in. "Excuse me, Miguel," Richard said, his curiosity now a driving force. "Were you just speaking Mandarin?" Miguel looked slightly embarrassed, then smiled. "Yes, sir. Sorry if I disturbed anyone." "Not at all," Richard replied, eyes narrowing. "How many languages do you speak?" 9. Miguel answered simply. 9? Richard almost laughed aloud. "You're telling me you, a janitor, speak 9 languages fluently?" Miguel shrugged modestly. "Fluently enough. Mandarin, French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, German, Japanese, Italian, and of course, English." The CEO was dumbfounded. How did that happen? Miguel leaned on his mop. "I was a linguistic officer in my home country, worked at several embassies, moved here when my wife fell ill and took this job because it allowed me flexible hours to care for her." The story hit Richard harder than he expected. This wasn't some eccentric hobbyist who watched foreign films. This was a trained professional hiding in plain sight. "Miguel, come to my office tomorrow at 10, Richard said. "I want to talk more." As he walked away, Richard knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something bigger, something extraordinary. The next morning, the entire office buzzed with rumors. Why was the CEO meeting with the janitor? What could they possibly have to discuss? But Richard knew something no one else did. Behind that mop was a mind that could bridge nations. He wasn't going to let it go to waste. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miguel stepped into Richard Kane's office, his expression calm but curious. Dressed in his usual blue overalls, he stood out in the room filled with executive furniture and polished fixtures. Richard, seated at his expansive walnut desk, gestured for him to sit. "Relax, Miguel," Richard said, leaning back. "This isn't a disciplinary meeting. Quite the opposite." Miguel sat, his posture straight, eyes attentive. "I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday," Richard began. 9 languages. Embassies. Your story is fascinating, but more than that, it's relevant." He folded his hands. Apex is pushing into international markets harder than ever. But despite hiring consultants and cultural liaisons, we keep running into communication failures, cultural gaps, things we don't see. Miguel nodded. That happens often when translations are too literal or without context. Culture is the heart of language. "Exactly," Richard said, smiling. "So here's what I'm proposing. I want you to attend our next international client meeting. Not to speak, not yet, just to observe. Take notes. Tell me what we miss." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "And what about my current duties?" "We'll reassign your cleaning schedule. Consider this a pilot project. You'll report directly to me." Miguel looked stunned. "Sir, I appreciate the opportunity, but why me?" Richard stood and walked to the window. "Because you were hiding in plain sight, and I believe the people who quietly watch and listen often understand the most." Miguel nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it." The following week, Miguel attended a client meeting with a German tech partner. He sat at the back, unnoticed by most. But his notes, precise, insightful, and brutally honest, were a revelation. He highlighted a phrase that had unintentionally offended the German delegation, a poorly translated metaphor, and a missed opportunity to build rapport by acknowledging a local holiday. Richard read the notes twice, then once more. The next morning, he called a senior meeting. "We're changing how we do international communication," he announced. "Starting today, Miguel will be part of our global engagement strategy." There was stunned silence. "Wait," one executive whispered. "The janitor." Richard smiled. "Not anymore." A week later, Richard Kane called an emergency strategy session. Representatives from 3 countries were flying in: Japan, Italy, and Brazil, to finalize a multi-million-dollar international partnership. Apex had struggled with similar meetings before, often losing deals to cultural misunderstandings. But this time, Richard had a plan. "Miguel." The invitation list raised eyebrows. Executives muttered about protocol and structure. "He's not qualified," some said. "He's a janitor," others whispered. But Richard stood firm. When the doors opened and Miguel entered, not with a mop, but in a tailored navy suit, clean-shaven, posture straight, the room froze. Some tried to hide their surprise. Others didn't bother. Richard stood. "This is Miguel Alvarez. He'll be leading our cultural alignment for today's session." The introductions began. A Japanese delegate spoke in hesitant English. Miguel responded in fluent Japanese, bowing gently. He greeted the Italian team with the warmth of a native Roman and addressed the Brazilians in crisp Portuguese, throwing in a football joke that had them all laughing. In less than 15 minutes, the ice was shattered. The atmosphere became relaxed, engaging, and collaborative. Throughout the meeting, Miguel bridged more than languages. He bridged emotions, intentions, and expectations. When a Japanese executive hesitated over a proposed clause, Miguel read between the lines, suggesting a phrasing that preserved honor and clarity. When the Italians pushed for a last-minute addition, Miguel mediated without offense, turning what could have been a deadlock into a handshake. After 2 hours, the deal was done. Applause broke out. As the delegates left, smiling and chatting, Richard turned to his skeptical executives. "He just saved us 6 months of negotiations," he said, "and probably $20 million. No one had anything to say. Later that evening, Richard posted a company-wide email. Subject: promotions and possibilities. Effective immediately, Miguel Alvarez is our new Director of Global Cultural Strategy. The office erupted. Cheers, disbelief, even tears. Those who had known Miguel as a kind janitor who helped fix vending machines now watched him ascend to an executive floor. In the break room where it all began, Miguel paused. He looked at his old cart, still parked in the corner, and smiled. Sometimes, the right words and the right language can change everything. The excitement for Miguel's promotion hadn't faded when another twist sent ripples through Apex Global Technologies. A week after Miguel moved into his new office, HR began a routine cleanup of his former janitorial closet to repurpose it as storage. Amidst old brooms and dustpans, a thick leather-bound notebook was discovered wedged between 2 cleaning supply shelves. Initially dismissed as a lost item, curiosity got the better of the HR assistant who flipped it open. Her eyes widened. Page after page contained detailed notes, not about mopping floors or supply inventories, but observations of office interactions, interdepartmental dynamics, and even potential employee conflicts. All written in neat cursive and multiple languages. The notebook was immediately brought to Richard Kane. He read silently for 10 minutes, face unreadable. Miguel had been watching everything, passively, but perceptively. Notes about tensions between the marketing and product teams, misunderstandings caused by miscommunications, unspoken hierarchies that created bottlenecks. Nothing malicious, just keen insights, like a sociologist documenting behavior in a corporate jungle. There were even sections where Miguel hypothesized solutions, cultural strategies, empathetic phrasing suggestions, and ways to diffuse potential conflicts. One note read, "If the project manager from Berlin is not looped in by Thursday, she will likely interpret it as exclusion rather than oversight. This may trigger silent resistance." And he was right. That very situation had unfolded 2 months ago, causing a minor but memorable delay in the software rollout. No one had seen it coming, except Miguel, it seemed. Richard called him in the next morning. "I found your notebook," he said, holding it up. Miguel looked slightly sheepish. "I kept note to understand the culture here. Language only goes so far. People are harder to read." You are reading all of us, Richard said, setting the book down gently, and documenting things even I missed. I never meant for anyone to see it. It was just my way of learning. Richard leaned forward. What you've done here, this isn't just observation. This is diagnostics. You've been mapping our culture from the inside the way no consultant ever could. He stood, pacing. Do you realize the value of this? Miguel nodded slowly. I do now. By the end of the week, Richard assembled the executive board for a confidential session. Miguel stood at the head of the table once more, this time not to speak foreign languages, but to translate behaviors. I'm not here to criticize, Miguel began, but I've seen patterns, misalignments between intent and perception. What I'd like to offer is a culture intelligence report. He projected his findings, collected from his notebook, into graphs, charts, and actionable insights. Silos between teams, gender communication gaps, cultural triggers, even subconscious biases. The boardroom was silent, not with skepticism, but awe. He ended the presentation with a quote in Latin, Verba volant, scripta manent. Words fly away, but writing remains. Richard broke the silence with applause. Slowly, the rest of the room followed. By month's end, Miguel's Culture Intelligence Report became mandatory reading for all department heads. A new internal task force, Project Insight, was launched under his leadership, focusing on company empathy, language training, and cross-cultural harmony. And the notebook? It was no longer hidden. A scanned version was shared across the company intranet, dubbed the Janitor's Journal. Employees, once skeptical, now quoted it in meetings. Even rival firms heard whispers of Apex's secret weapon, a janitor-turned-executive with eyes sharper than most consultants and a heart attuned to human connection. As Miguel passed through the corridors he once cleaned, employees smiled, nodded, and, on occasion, greeted him in a different language. And he responded in kind, always with a twinkle in his eye. He had started as a silent observer. Now, he was the voice everyone listened to. Just when Apex Global Technologies was basking in the glow of their international deal and newfound cultural alignment, disaster struck. At their Tokyo branch, Apex's newest and most ambitious overseas expansion, a major miscommunication during a government tender pitch had ignited a diplomatic storm. The client, a semi-government tech council, felt disrespected by what they called an arrogant and culturally ignorant presentation. Within hours, the Japanese media was covering the story. Headlines accused Apex of being tone-deaf. Stocks fluttered, and the Tokyo office reported that their scheduled follow-up meetings had been cancelled. The executive floor was in chaos. We need damage control, the COO barked. Send legal. Send PR. We'll draft an apology. No, Richard Kane interrupted. We're sending Miguel. The room froze. The janitor again, someone whispered, still clinging to the past. No, Richard said firmly. Our director of global cultural strategy. 3 hours later, Miguel was on a flight to Tokyo. He traveled light, just a carry-on and the digital tablet that now housed the expanded Janitor's Journal, Project Insight. By the time his plane landed, Miguel had already reviewed the original pitch, the translations, and the video footage of the presentation. It was clear. The tone of the slides, the Western-style humor, and even the body language of the presenter had created an unintentional wall of offense. The content had been accurate, but the context was all wrong. When Miguel arrived at the Tokyo office, he didn't start with meetings. He asked to sit with the local staff, especially the receptionists, the junior analysts, and the internal translators. Over cups of matcha and quiet hallway conversations, he gathered emotional truths that no report could have captured. Only then did he request a meeting with the Tech Council. The Japanese executives agreed, reluctantly, but when they entered the room and Miguel stood, bowing deeply and greeting each of them in perfect, nuanced Japanese, their expressions softened. He began not with defense, but with understanding. We came in with knowledge, but not with wisdom, he said in Japanese. We translated words, but not values, and for that we sincerely apologize. The room was silent. Then Miguel did something even more unexpected. He handed out rewritten proposals, not by a translator, but but entirely reformulated with local customs in mind. He included a section that highlighted mutual values, and at the end, he offered an optional partnership model rooted in long-term trust and honor. The senior Japanese official, who had remained stoic, finally spoke. "You didn't just hear our words. You heard our silence." Miguel bowed. "Language taught me that silence is also speech." The meeting lasted another 2 hours, and when it ended, not only was Apex a given, they were invited to resubmit under a renewed timeline, this time as a trusted collaborator. Back in the U.S., the news broke through a company-wide email titled, "Tokyo Crisis Turned Opportunity. Thanks to Miguel." The story went viral internally. Executives who had once raised eyebrows now raised glasses in his honor. Employees across the globe started referring to him as the culture whisperer. More importantly, companies in the industry started reaching out to Apex, not just for products, but for insight into cultural strategy. Richard saw the potential. He called Miguel into his office. "I think you need to start something bigger," he said. "Not just internally. What if we launch a consultancy? You'd lead it. Help companies everywhere. Apex would back it." Miguel looked down at his hands. "From mops to missions." Richard grinned. "Exactly." Miguel nodded slowly, the weight of his journey not lost on him. "I'll do it, but on one condition." "Anything." "I want to keep my badge, the old janitor one, as a reminder." Richard laughed. "Deal." And with that, a new division of Apex was born, Apex Insight, a consultancy dedicated to cross-cultural communication, diplomacy, and global leadership. At its helm, a man who once swept the floors, but now was helping sweep away ignorance with empathy, humility, and the quiet power of listening. 6 months had passed since Miguel Alvarez diffused the Tokyo crisis and ignited a cultural revolution inside Apex Global Technologies. What began as a spontaneous observation in a break room had blossomed into something unprecedented, a movement. Under the new banner of Apex Insight, Miguel's division didn't just support internal operations anymore. They consulted for Fortune 500 companies, governments, and NGOs. Demand was staggering. Multinational giants were lining up, not for Apex's software, but for Miguel's cultural blueprints. He had become the unlikely face of modern leadership. Miguel, however, remained grounded. He refused an office on the executive floor, choosing instead a modest workspace surrounded by translators, cultural liaisons, and interns. He insisted on weekly walkthroughs of the building, something Richard initially thought nostalgic but later realized was strategic. "Perspective," Miguel explained. "I don't ever want to forget what this place looks like from the ground level." One crisp morning, Richard walked into a full-staff town hall meeting. Miguel was already at the podium, speaking, not just in English, but weaving in Arabic greetings, Japanese expressions, and Spanish idioms that lit up the diverse crowd. "Our strength," Miguel said, "is not in what we know, but in how we listen, not in how loud we speak, but in the grace with which we translate understanding." Thunderous applause followed. It was the first time employees had seen executives cheering alongside janitors, interns, and front desk staff, all equally inspired. Later that day, Richard called Miguel into his office. "There's talk of nominating you for a Global Leadership Award," Richard said. "UN delegates, Harvard, Davos. They want you to speak." Miguel smiled softly. "I'm honored, but I think my work speaks better than I do." Richard leaned forward. "You've changed everything. Not just here. The whole industry is watching us now. I built this company with technology. You're rebuilding it with empathy." Miguel looked at the CEO and said, "I didn't rebuild it. I just reminded people of what was already here." That afternoon, Miguel took a quiet walk down to the maintenance floor, his old world. The cleaning crew greeted him with wide smiles and respectful nods. One younger janitor stopped him. "Sir, I heard you used to be one of us." Miguel chuckled. "I still am." The janitor looked down. "I'm studying Hindi and Portuguese in night school. Maybe someday." Miguel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Someday comes faster than you think. Just keep learning and listening." He handed him a card. It read, "Apex Insight Intern Program, referral by M.A. That evening, Miguel returned to his desk and opened the drawer. Inside was his old janitor ID badge. He stared at it for a long time before carefully placing it inside a clear frame. Then he wrote on it, "This was never a job, it was my foundation." Months later, as Miguel stood at the World Leadership Forum in Geneva, introduced as the man who rewrote the language of business, the room erupted in a standing ovation. But even then, he started his speech with a quiet smile and just 2 words, "Buenas tardes." Because even at the top, he knew the true language of leadership was humility.